Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Lessons from the United Kingdom. My name is Charlotte Mueller. I'm a communications manager at RGI, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the fourth edition of RGI and OCEaN's Country Profile webinar series. We have a really great array of speakers today, but before I introduce them, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules and outline the structure of today's event. So we ask that you rename yourself in Zoom with both your name and your organization, to keep yourself muted while others are speaking, and to write your questions in the chat throughout the presentations. We'll have plenty of time to address them at the end of the presentations. During the Q&A period at the end, I will ask that you turn your cameras on to make a more interactive Q&A session, especially if you're asking a question directly to our speakers. So what can you expect from today? This webinar is about 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'll start with introducing RGI and OCEaN, the context for this webinar, and then introduce our speakers. I'll pass it off to our speakers and we'll have time to address questions at the end of the webinar as well. So as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is co-organized by the Renewables Grid Initiative and OCEaN, the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. RGI is a member-based NGO founded in 2009 with members from transmission system operators and environmental and climate NGOs, as well as supporting organizations. We promote fair, transparent, sustainable grid development to enable the growth of renewables and achieve full decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement. In 2020, recognizing the large role that offshore wind is going to play in Europe's energy transition, as well as its connected grid infrastructure, RGI partnered up with TSOs, NGOs, and wind industry members to found the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. Our goal as OCEaN is to enable an acceleration of offshore wind and grids alongside marine ecosystem protection and restoration. RGI acts as both the convener and the moderator of this group of 50+ members in 2 coalitions, one in the North and Baltic Seas and one in the Mediterranean and adjacent Atlantic waters. Our 2 coalitions are working together every day to fill knowledge gaps, advocate for our shared messages, and create open forums for discussion on topics ranging from nature-inclusive design to mitigation measures, marine spatial planning, nature restoration, data collection, and more. Here you can see an array of our members in the North and Baltic Seas, and here are members in the newer coalition in the Mediterranean, founded in 2023. In 2024, in collaboration with other members, we launched this webinar series. We wanted to highlight European nations' approach to nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment. Our hope with these webinars is that it allows viewers to better understand how policy and regulatory frameworks in these countries are enabling acceleration and tackling challenges, and what lessons we can learn and share across borders. We've held webinars so far on the Netherlands, Denmark, and France, with a fact sheet released of highlights of these countries for each one we featured. Recognizing the leading role the UK is playing in Europe's offshore energy transition, we chose it for our 4th webinar, which is today. The UK represents more than 40% of European offshore wind capacity and has plans to expand from around 15 gigawatts today to 43 to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Our speakers will be outlining what the UK's approach to nature and energy planning is to reach these targets, the interconnections between these approaches and the stakeholders they're working with, and what they've learned over the past 20 years of offshore wind deployment in the UK. To walk us through this process, we're thrilled to be joined by 3 expert speakers today. The first is Olivia Thomas. She's the head of planning and technical with the Crown Estates. We have Kat Rood-Stevens, the head of environment and consents at RenewableUK, the trade association representing renewables in the United Kingdom. And lastly, we have Samuel Roble, a senior marine policy officer and longtime friend of OCEaN at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, or RSPB. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Olivia. She's going to outline the unique role of the Crown Estates in the offshore wind sphere in the UK as the owner and leaser of seabed rights in UK waters. So Olivia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, everyone. I look forward to the discussion we have today and welcome your questions as we get to the end of our presentations. If we move into the first slide, I think I wanted to cover in around 10 minutes the role of the Crown Estate, because I've used the term relatively unique, and I don't think you can be relatively unique, but there are other organisations with similar type accountabilities to the Crown Estate, but we believe we're unique in the way that we manage the long-term rights of the seabed in the context of government regulation, planning, and policy. And so what I'll do is I'll describe a bit of that role and how we want to use that role to really unlock the challenge that we're discussing today, that acceleration of offshore wind and enabling nature recovery, both of which are critical for us meeting shared outcomes that we share globally, actually on a global scale. So in terms of the Crown Estate, we date back over 260 years. We've got a diverse portfolio, so the things that we have responsibility over and that we manage are both on land and in the marine. And obviously for the purposes of today's conversation, I will focus on the marine. Our role extends around England, Wales and Northern Ireland, so not the entirety of the UK, which also presents an interesting dynamic as to how we consider the UK as a whole and how we consider our impact as a whole. So we can come on to that in a second. We are framed under an Act of Parliament that guides what we do, and we are an independent commercial business. So when we think about value, we think about value holistically, whether that's value in the natural sense, whether that's value to society, whether that's value in terms of decarbonisation and the role that we can play, or whether that's financial value. And that financial value, the net profits that we make, we pay back into our government through our treasury on an annual basis for the benefit of the nation. So as we step onto the next slide, really what this is trying to show is that we are a purpose-led organisation. So we are here for the long term. We've been here a long time, and we are really here to create that shared and lasting prosperity, so that value for the nation. And I've started to talk about how. So net zero is absolutely critical to us. We describe this in many different ways at the moment, whether that is energy security, whether that is meeting decarbonisation targets, but that recognition that we will need to continue to support and invest in the development of renewable energy is a core part of that. Nature recovery, none of us can work with a sustainable future ahead of us without enabling nature recovery, and that's a critical part. And that's holistic in terms of how we think about the role that we could play, the partnerships and the relationships, and how we invest in answering and unlocking some of those nature recovery challenges that we'll discuss in today's session. And then the thriving communities part, we have places to think about, and we have human interaction in those places. So we must think about what that means for the communities and the interactions that we have offshore. The next slide really just shows some of the impact that we've had, both financially and how we invest ourselves, but then also in terms of the developments that we've seen in the marine environment. And we'll talk about these in the coming slides. But the focus I wanted to have today on the next slide is the marine environment, as we say. So the Crown Estate's responsibilities are out over the seabed to 12 nautical miles. Now, you can see a tiny white line that looks like it straddles the coastline that shows that. I will set what that looks like in the context of the regulatory framework in a second, but those responsibilities mean that anything that has an interface or below the seabed, we lease and license. And what we don't want to do is just act in a reactive landlord sense. We do not want to just lease or license something in isolation without thinking about what the value of the seabed is holistically, and think about the long-term optimal use of that space. So we're starting to build a fuller picture, and this is what I'll come on to in a second, a fuller picture of what the needs, demands are over the marine space and the seabed, so that we can sustainably manage for the long term. And we can leverage a lot of our opportunity being a public body and looking to plan for the long term by working in the context of policy, by working with those who need to use the seabed and who have shared outcomes over the same space, such as developing renewable energy and enabling that nature recovery. So we describe those different needs in a sectoral way, and you can see that the pan-sectoral view is what we're trying to achieve, and we're trying to reflect that spatially to help give us a tool to start to take decisions. So the next slide shows some of the acts that we have to consider. We have a statutory framing. There is a statutory, there are a number of actually statutory marine planning authorities in the UK. They are devolved to the different nations, and there are a number of statutory marine plans that guide what we do or don't do in the marine environment. There is policy that sits above that and legislation that sits above that. So for the Crown Estate, we're guided by our responsibilities, and that enables us to manage the seabed for a number of different sectors, as I say, out to 12 nautical miles. But we have other responsibilities that go all the way out to our EEZ, and they afford us the rights to lease renewable energy development and carbon capture, storage, and other associated infrastructure, as well as mineral dredging. So it means that we have a role that picks up responsibilities for managing certain things, but equally means that we have to consider a whole number of things that we don't have responsibility for. So we don't have responsibility over the water column. We cannot control what happens with the public rights to navigate, the public rights to fish. We do not have responsibilities over oil, coal, and gas either. So there is a statutory body that regulates environmentally. There is a statutory body who drives the licensing for oil and gas, and actually for carbon storage as well. So we have a shared role there. That is the North Sea Transition Authority. So our role is, it's important we take our role in that holistic sense of considering who else takes decisions in the marine environment and what layers of regulation do we need to consider that actually drive us all towards those same shared outcomes. So we have a range of different interests. We have a range of different established development and sectors, but equally new and emerging ideas on how we might use the seabed collectively. So all of these things come into play as we take our decisions. So the next slide, I just wanted to frame some of the key, I suppose, developments, if I call them that, but the things that are guiding the acceleration of offshore wind and nature protection in the marine environment. The slide sets out the last 18 months. But before that, it's really important to note, and this we had an Environment Act in 2021, that the UK is committed as part of the global effort to the 30 by 30. So protecting 30% of the UK's lands and seas. And that's really important in ensuring the most wildlife rich habitats are managed for conservation, but really we start to move the dial in restoring some of those critical habitats that we see in the marine environment as well. So for the marine environment, there is a target of restoring 70% of marine protected areas to favourable condition by 2042. As we think about that, the marine protected areas is that network to enable that ecological resilience, but we must think about the ecology in the marine environment and what that might mean holistically as we take our decisions going forward. So that's some of what we're trying to think about at the moment. We've had a number of industrial focused signals and investment plans for driving clean energy development. We've had the Great British Energy established, and the Crown Estate has set out a partnership in the offshore aspect to look at how we work together to enable offshore wind development, to look at further opportunities for de-risking, and to further enhance the opportunities around wind development, whether that's the supply chain or whether that is lowering uncertainty in particular areas. And then from the Crown Estate perspective, we have gone through a number of different, we run structured leasing processes when it comes to offshore wind to ensure they're not anti-competitive. So we do a lot of upfront work to design then what seabed goes out to offer. And we do that in structured leasing rounds. So you hear, and I've made reference to round 4, and then seabed leasing round 5, which is the first time we offered up seabed rights for floating wind development. Now, Kat will probably touch on a little bit of this, but it comes very early in the development life cycle for wind. And what we do up front has a real opportunity to critically change then how much we de-risk and set opportunity for those shared outcomes of offshore wind and nature recovery as we step forward. So as we move on to the next couple of slides, really I wanted to talk a little bit now about the how. So we are starting to develop a marine delivery route map, a decision-making tool that will help to provide scenarios of what those achieving those shared outcomes might look like all the way out to 2050. And clearly we have better certainty on what's going to happen in the next few years out to the future years, but what we do now can absolutely affect what we do in future. So how we take our investments, how we design considering nature in mind, how we consider the other needs and demands over the marine space, food security through fisheries, defense, and how the seabed might be used for other different objectives that need to be achieved. So we're building an evidence base. We've called that a whole of seabed evidence base, and that then underpins a decision-making tool that we have in development to meet the shared outcomes you see on the right there. So as we step through to the next slide, this really just gives a bit of that purpose-led intention around what the route map will do for us. So we need to strategically plan, but what we cannot do in isolation. So this is absolutely integral that we work with stakeholders, we work with the market and understand the offshore wind industry needs, what makes the UK an attractive place to land investment and to develop into the future, and what makes it a sustainable place. So what do we need to design in nature up front? How do we start to build nature design principles? How do we actively make space for nature and then invest in the evidence and some of the understanding that will act as a baseline to inform those decisions on what bits of seabed get used for what things? So really our intention around a marine delivery route map tool is our decision-making tool for everyone and strategic planning for us to help meet those shared objectives. So that's what that's trying to achieve. And if we step through to the next slide, I wanted to just quickly frame our role in terms of offshore wind, but actually I know that Kat will do a lot more of this. So really it's from developing a route map, what does that mean then for offshore wind? And I've started to talk about this already, but balancing multiple stakeholder interests early on. If we design right, in the right way up front, and we engage actively, by the time that an offshore wind developer picks up rights over a bit of seabed, there should be a lot less risk. There should be greater certainty on what's needed in order to then develop in a way that is the most sustainable and can take quicker decisions into that project development life cycle later on. So really that's where we're trying to drive that strategic system shaping. And part of that is also how we consider the regulatory environment around us as well. So the habitats regulations, as they're transposed into UK law, how we think about marine protected areas, how we try to absolutely avoid the need to compensate environmentally, but if there is a need for compensation, how do we think about those things strategically? So that is what is guiding us and how that applies to our role. So then if I come on to the next slide, thank you, Charlotte. The last two slides really are about an example of how we are investing in evidence. The important part of the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, and I'll provide a link in the chat afterwards so that you can have a look in your own time. We set this up 5 years ago as a £50 million investment in answering some of the critical evidence gaps. But what it's sought to do is go beyond just the we have a lack of understanding here, so we need an answer. Actually, how does that drive a change in our decision making? And the impact pathways, as we describe them, from the point in which we are investing in evidence through to then that changing a decision, is really where we're trying to get to with OWEC. And the pie chart shows how we've invested across different topics. We are absolutely steered, so again, this collaborative role, by 25 organisations who help shape what is the critical need here if we're going to accelerate wind in a way that enables us to have these clean, healthy, productive seas. What does that look like? Where are the gaps in our understanding? And then the last slide I have is just to show some of the evidence as that's playing through now. So we have, it might need another click, please, Charlotte. Thank you. Yeah, it's a little animated. So we have a number of different ways we're investing, including with other bodies like the National Research Councils, to think about how we consider the ecological impact of offshore wind development. That's the ECOs, so the eco wind, the eco flow. So starting to think about innovative approaches to wind development with floating wind technology, and investing in the European lens around forecasting biodiversity and ecological changes through eco change. And then we have a number of, as we're thinking about the critical critical challenges that Kat and Sam will set out, some of those investments in trying to answer where the critical evidence gaps are. And then right at the beginning, when we were talking about lowering the risk and the burden for project by project development, one of the things we've wanted to do is build that baseline understanding that informs environmental impact assessment. So lots of acronyms, but OWEA and OWECA, so the evidence register, the environmental evidence register, and the environmental knowledge hub are seeking to build that evidence base that then we can all align around, that we say this is the absolute banked understanding. For my project, I only need to now do this. So we're trying to lower the precautionary approach and the duplication project by project and start to build a strategic level understanding. So I'll leave it there and pass back to Charlotte, but very happy to take questions when we come to them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Olivia, for kickstarting the webinar and outlining everything that's happening in the UK and how the Crown Estate's role is enabling that acceleration. I'd like to pass the word on now to Kat Root-Stevens from Renewable UK. Kat, you have the floor.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. So if we could go through to, let's start on that one. So I'm Kat Root-Stevens. I head up our Environment and Consenting Work Programme at Renewable UK and for the Offshore Wind Industry Council. I'll just give you a quick flavour of who we are. So Renewable UK is the leading trade association for renewable energy. In the UK, we cover all different wind technologies, battery storage, grid, as well as all supply chain companies as well in the renewable space. We have over 400 members, and these are the people and the organisations that are really implementing the vision for a renewable energy system in the UK and making that happen. Then the Offshore Wind Industry Council. This is a senior level government industry partnership. The programme is co-chaired by the Secretary of State for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and an industry co-chair as well, who is currently Adam Morrison from Ocean Winds. And through the Offshore Wind Industry Council, we have several different work streams looking at how we can accelerate the deployment of offshore wind in the UK. This includes the Environment and Consenting Work Programme, which I'm responsible for. We've got ones around supply chain, people and skills, aviation and innovation as well. So we cover quite a broad range of topics there. So if we can move on to the next slide. And if you just click through, yeah, perfect, thank you. So the title of this webinar is Accelerating Offshore Wind and Nature Recovery. And this slide here just outlines where we are with offshore wind in the UK and then how that overlays with the protected sites that we have in UK waters. So the image on the left-hand side shows all different potential sites for offshore wind. We probably should have clicked off some of those. So the brown areas are potential areas for offshore wind subject to future leasing that live outlined by the Crown Estate. But we have over 16 gigawatts of operational offshore wind projects across the UK. I think it's slightly more than that. But that's enough to power 60% of UK homes. So we're already delivering quite a lot of energy into the system across the UK. And there are targets to increase that amount of energy to 43 to 50 gigawatts by 2030. So 5 years' time to significantly increase the amount of offshore wind that we have operational. Then on the other hand, we have a lot of protected sites. These have been established over multiple years, making sure that we are protecting and conserving those special areas across the UK. And this is a mixture of European designated sites, so the Natura 2000 sites, but also some domestic sites, so marine protected areas in the UK. We can click through to the next one, please. So following on from Liv, I'll just give an overview of what the processes are, the industry or like the whole framework around offshore wind in the UK, and some of the stages that developers need to go through before they can even deploy an offshore wind project here. So overarching, we have the offshore wind strategic environmental assessment. This covers all different types of energy generation at sea, so it includes oil and gas, but offshore wind as well, and some of the supporting infrastructure, cables, those sorts of things. And that covers the majority of the UK. I can't remember exact boundaries of that one. But as Charlotte mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar, we do have different approaches across the UK, across the 4 nations that we've got. So underneath the strategic environmental assessment, we have a series of marine plans, and these vary between different countries. In England, there are a series of regional marine plans, which are developed by the Marine Management Organisation. In Wales, there's the Welsh National Marine Plan, which covers all of Welsh waters. And in Scotland, there's the National Marine Plan, which has a subsequent sectoral marine plan for offshore wind. So it sets out the relevant policies and areas and those sorts of things specifically for offshore wind there. Northern Ireland also has a marine plan that is in development at the moment as well. So then seabed leasing, as Liv mentioned, this is down to the Crown Estate or Crown Estate Scotland, who own the majority of the seabed around the UK. And there'll be a leasing process that happens to make sure that the most valuable pieces of the sea for offshore wind are put out to market. And this is a very structured approach. It's plan-led. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement that goes into that process. And we have had 5 rounds since 2020. The leasing round 5 that Liv mentioned down off the southwest of the UK, looking at floating offshore wind. And I know there are plans to make sure we've got that visibility of pipeline and future opportunities in the UK as well. So then we get to the project level consenting. So you've gone through the process, you've got your lease, and now you need to get your consent to go ahead with the project. So if we can skip to the next slide, I'll just go into some of these in a bit more detail at the different stages. So each of the different nations across the UK has slightly different ways of consenting offshore wind, but I'll give a general picture here. So the majority of projects across England and Wales go through a process called the Development Consent Order route, which is underneath the Planning Act. And this is a very structured approach. It's got very robust timelines associated with it and different stages to be able to obtain your consent after going through an examination process. And in Scotland, you'd need a marine licence and also a Section 36 energy generating consent there. So 2 different consents that are done simultaneously for your different projects. So what goes into a consent application? Pretty much all offshore wind projects across the UK will need to do an environmental impact assessment. So this is to understand and consider what those potential environmental impacts would be on a series of different receptors, social, economic, environmental, and that information is then used by decision makers while they're determining applications. And also by the developers as well to understand where they can avoid, mitigate or compensate potential impacts, but also to understand positive impacts from the project. And this is a very transparent process. One of the requirements around it is to have a non-technical summary that sits along your environmental statement, so it can be very easily understood by anyone who's got an interest in that. Then one of the other big assessments that takes up quite a lot of capacity across anyone who's involved in offshore wind is the Habitats Regulations Assessment. And this goes back to that diagram I was showing, the overlap between the protected sites that we have in the UK and potential areas for offshore wind as well. So this is from the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive transposed into UK law. It's a staged process to understand what those potential impacts would be to the UK National Sites Network. So the first stage is screening. is there a potential pathway to have an impact from the project on a protected site? If yes, you move on to the appropriate assessment stage to really drill down into the detail of what those potential impacts could be, how you can mitigate for some of those impacts. And in the UK, we are at a stage where a lot of projects are now having to go down the derogation route. So if you've done your appropriate assessment, you can't rule out that there will be a significant impact on a protected site due to a combination of factors. So then you move on to the alternatives assessment. Can the aims of that project be delivered in a different way that is less impactful? If not, are there reasons of overriding public interest? So does the project need to go ahead? Is it in the interest of greater interests to move forward with it? We've got a lot of supporting policy around that in the UK with renewable energy targets. And if yes to that one, then you need to deliver compensation to offset those impacts to the protected site network. Some of the other assessments, just to touch on them, that developers need to do at the same time are things around like navigation and shipping risk assessments, Water Framework Directive assessments, and then looking at other sea users, so commercial fisheries and also marine archaeology as well. So all of these different things go into a consent application. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So this outlines rough timelines around the consenting process for offshore wind across the UK. So all of those different assessments that I was talking through, they all need to be done in quite a short amount of time. Well, between 2 to 3 years before you submit your consent application, after you've gone through the process of getting your lease. And developers will do up to 2 years worth of bird surveys to understand bird and marine mammal use of an area. They'll go through EIA scoping, completing environmental surveys, and all of this is used to inform the detailed design for a project. Then you go through your consenting process, which is around about 18 months to 2 years, give or take on that a little bit. Once you've got your consent, there's all your consent compliance, so discharging conditions that are associated with your consent, doing more surveys to understand the actual the conditions of the site that a project is set to be developed on. You've got your construction, which environmental monitoring sits alongside that, operational, and then right through to decommissioning as well. So all of these different stages need to be considered way up front to inform your consent application. And alongside all of this, there is continuous stakeholder engagement and consultation that happens. So with like statutory nature conservation bodies, government departments, key stakeholder organisations such as environmental and non-government organisations and charities and those sorts of things. The bit that I haven't touched on too much is around like the finance aspect of this. So after you've got your consent, projects will enter into a contracts for difference. And this is, I won't go into it too much right now, but that is how we can make sure that the energy is secured and these projects can go forward. So if we move on to the last slide. So some of the challenges that are facing the offshore wind sector at the moment and how we're addressing some of these through the work that OCEaN is doing. We have a coordination group which is made up of multiple different stakeholder organisations and industry called the Pathways to Growth Coordination Group. And through that we've come up with 7 focus areas, looking at what some of the key challenges are that are facing the offshore wind sector and how we can move forward to make sure that we achieve the targets that have been set by government and making sure we're delivering offshore wind in a sustainable way in the consenting and environment space. So I'll quickly touch on all 7, but won't go into detail on them. So we've got strategic compensation there. As I mentioned, a lot of projects are going down the derogation route for habitats regulations assessments. So instead of doing compensation on a project by project level, how can we do that more strategically to make sure that we're delivering the best environmental outcomes where there is a need to compensate? So some of the work that's underway around that is the Marine Recovery Fund, which is being established by the government at the moment. And we hope that will be operational by the end of the year. We've got a project which is being kindly funded through LIV's offshore wind environmental change programme called the Strategic Compensation Studies Project. So trying to make sure we've got that comprehensive evidence base there. The next one is around strategic planning. So a lot of this is the work that the Crown Estate are doing to get that really good understanding of how we want to use the sea and how offshore wind fits within that. So the work under the Marine Delivery Route Map, and also work that government is doing around marine spatial prioritisation as well, to help give that certainty and signals to the industry that the UK does want offshore wind in its waters. And we've got adaptive management, so how we can use the last 25 years of offshore wind deployment in the UK and the evidence that's been gathered across that time into decision making. So how can we maybe retire some of the issues that keep coming up but maybe aren't significant? Underwater noise and impacts to marine mammals. This is quite a hot topic at the moment. And a lot of work is going on around cross-industry coordination. So the offshore wind sector is working quite closely with, say, the oil and gas sector when they need to maybe do noisy seismic surveys at the same time as offshore wind construction. So that coordination piece can happen and reduce those potential environmental impacts. Cumulative impact assessment. So that first diagram that I showed shows there's quite a lot of offshore wind, not just in the UK, but also across Europe and the North Sea Basin. So how we can get a good understanding of what those actual cumulative impacts would be. And a tool that we're developing at the moment is called the As-Built Register. So instead of your consented parameters, what was actually built, so we can do a more robust assessment on potential impacts. We've got biodiversity targets as well. There are plans to introduce marine net gain, so understanding how offshore wind fits within that, and a lot of developers are being very proactive in this space, looking at nature inclusive designs that they can already implement on projects. So like looking at rock protection that can be colonised at a faster rate. And then finally, proportionate assessments. So environmental impacts assessments and HRAs, they can run into tens of thousands of pages at the moment. So how can we make sure that these are streamlined as much as possible, making sure that we're using the best use of resources, not just for industry, but also all of those different stakeholders that need to assess these documents as well. So again, this builds on some of the work that the Crown Estate are doing to move us forward in that space. So I think that is the last slide of a very quick whistle stop through how consenting works in the UK, and really happy to have any questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katya. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on some of the specificities of what you went over. It was a great overview, I think, of the many steps offshore wind has to go through and the way nature is involved throughout those processes to get these offshore wind parks successfully implemented. So I will now pass the word off to Samuel Roble from RSPB. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. And yeah, I mean, great job from Kat and Olivia there from talking through what is an incredibly complex situation across 4 countries that is sort of one country that operates all in different ways. No mean feat. So yeah, hi everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Samuel Roble, so Senior Marine Policy Officer here at the RSPB. If you're not aware of the RSPB previously, so we are one of Europe's largest environmental NGOs. We're 136 years old, I think, so we've been going a wee while now. And we work not only in the UK, but also globally. Because of our role in offshore marine policy, we also have a supporting role across the BirdLife Partnership across Europe and Central Asia to kind of support our partners in that space as well. And we work really closely with Kat Olivia and their teams in the Crown Estate and Renewable UK to find these solutions about how we de-risk the future and what that means and how we embed nature in the start of that, so we can do a lot of that front loading up front and then come back to de-risking later on. So what I think I'd like to finish up with today is basically trying to add the context and the environmental context to what we've just kind of talked through and how that's kind of looking and what that means for our marine environments and our net zero target. So if we kick off on to the next slide, I do want to kind of start here and talk about the reminder of the context of the situation that we're dealing with in the UK. So there's various kind of facts and figures on here, and this is kind of our top headlines of the state of UK seabirds. But the main thing here is looking at that graph, there's quite a steep drop off at the end. So that is the population decline of UK seabirds. So we've seen a pretty immediate drop in the last kind of 5 years or so. That's been from bird flu, but generally we've seen a decline over the last 20 years. So we're dealing with quite a fragile environment. With the RSPB, Royal Society Protection of Birds, we do focus on birds. And the reason we do that is because they are indicator species. So these declines are because they're an apex predator, they're at the top, and they're relying on the rest of the marine ecosystem underneath them to support them. So if they're failing, it demonstrates that something isn't lining up underneath them, essentially. So why do we have to get this right? Why is this a problem for renewable energy, for net zero, for all sorts of various components? Well, there's a few reasons. Partly the UK, we're globally significant for seabirds. You know, for a tiny little island and collection of islands, we pack a punch in terms of birds. We've got kind of global numbers. Almost 60% of the world's gannets are found in the UK, kind of various huge amounts of colonies all found on our little shores. There's also the social and economic value of that. As I mentioned, the indicator species, that failing ecosystem is not good for business. So how do we kind of bring that together and collectively have a healthy marine ecosystem that supports multiple businesses and livelihoods across the UK? There are also legal obligations at play here. So we have a UK marine strategy for our national obligations to protect the marine environment. But there's also the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and OSPAR commitments as well that require us to basically uphold to good environmental status and protect our habitats and species. And I think what's really important in the context of this is that a healthy, resilient marine environment accelerates energy growth. And kind of what I mean by that is a healthy baseline reduces the risk and allows us to build quicker. So at the moment, with the state of seabirds and the rate of employment, we've got a sky high risk. If we can increase our baseline to match that rate of deployment, that reduces the risk and it enables us to accelerate quicker. So that's kind of our main message that we've been working on collectively, kind of with RenewableUK and with Crown Estate to establish and build up over time. So if we fire on to the next slide. So in terms of spatial planning stuff, and Kat did a really helpful job of kind of talking through some of the various elements that are at play here, and Olivia as well, around how we've got multiple mapping exercises happening at different scales across the UK. My laptop is about to die, so I'm just going to grab my charger here. But we're working across multiple areas at different levels, and they are all doing different stuff. So it is a challenge to work on all of them. It doesn't make it as coherent, but they are doing different things, and we need to focus on those where it's relevant. So the core issue of what this comes back to, and kind of we had the map there of the protected areas from before, is that our protected area network at sea is incomplete in the UK, particularly for seabirds. So we have kind of it's not really a collective agreement, but there is a general recognition that we need to avoid MPAs at sea. So this is kind of from UK SNCBs and a lot of the NGOs. We need to avoid marine protected areas. What this kind of really tricky map, and we've all shown really complex, difficult maps to read, but what this tries to show is the purple bits are protected areas. the green slimy stuff, those are actually kittiwake distribution. They don't really match up with the protected area network. So if we do a blanket avoid all MPAs, the risk is we put all of our wind farms where the seabirds are, and that doesn't then slow down the reduce the risk or help accelerate the consent. So that's the crux of the issue. If we had a complete network, we'd have a lot more clarity in the system. There's two solutions needed for this. So for complete sea user clarity, and what I mean by that is overall marine spatial prioritization for well beyond offshore wind, talking about multiple industries, not only on the seabed, but in that water column as well. What we need is an SPA sufficiency review. It's a jargony word to basically say we need to look at our protected area network and is it doing the right job, particularly for seabirds. We think there are some significant gaps in it. We need to close those and make sure that the right bits are in the right places. And that helps draw lines on a map. We know that birds go a lot of places. So what we're talking about here is the really critical bits. Where are they going to find their food and going back to the colony again? And let's make sure that's captured. A full-blown SBA sufficiency review takes time, it takes resource, and we're kind of working through that at the moment of how we can help deliver that. So in the meantime, we've been working really closely with the Crown Estate to look at, well, how can we unlock the future of offshore wind in that space? And what that basically means is we're trying to capture the needs of seabirds in those future leasing. So this is where some of that whole of seabed and marine delivery route map work that Olivia was talking about. We're trying to create a seabird hotspot map that we can use to review those future layers. So we're working with the Crown Estate to create this kind of fancy hotspot layer that you can whack on and go, right, those bits are really important. They're not in the protected area network, but we've got NGOs, we've got SNCBs around the table. We've used all the best available data we've got. These are our expert areas that we think are going to be really important. And how do we review that? There is future projects coming on. So I've mentioned Natural England's Poseidon work here, which we can drop a link to as well. That's a full-blown kind of seabird distribution modeling and risk assessment, particularly around offshore wind, which is going to be amazing. And that will help refine those areas more to get those most critical bits. So this is the really exciting bit. And this is where going forward, there's huge opportunities here. But it's collective to kind of agree on here that this hasn't been done before. It's really hard and it's not been done before. And unfortunately, that is kind of what has led us to get into some quite sticky situations that we're kind of working through at the same time. So if we move on to the next slide, is where we kind of talk about the strategic compensation side of things. So Kat mentioned this in the kind of several elements that are going on. So I'm going to dive into this one a little bit more. But this is primarily that previously mentioned sticky situation. So in the UK, I think we would argue this is we have an imbalanced reliance on compensation in the theory that we can use this to kind of work through and just build as quickly as we can. And I think what the risk is here is that compensation must always be that last resort. And collectively, this is why we've been pushing to work on those avoidance areas and kind of build this into the system. And both Kat and Olivia have mentioned about how we front load that system. And that's where we need to put the effort into. But we need to recognize that that's not where we're at. We've got a pipeline of offshore wind in the system at the moment that needs to be unlocked, that we need to get built. And to do that, we need to roll out some really effective compensation measures. So I won't go into too much detail about the history of compensation, but it started out on that project level, basically one wind farm developer to do one measure. And it was quickly realized that that was really, really difficult, particularly in the marine environment and particularly with seabirds, where they're long-lived, they take several years to reach breeding maturity. Many of them only have 1 or 2 chicks a year as well. So all of a sudden you can see it can take 5 or 6 years to go from 1 bird to maybe only 3 birds. So that takes a long time, and that is a big challenge. So the concept of strategic compensation was introduced to work much more collaboratively. So that's where DEFRA established this collaboration on offshore wind and strategic compensation, or CAOSC, as I'll refer it to now, because it's really long-winded. And that is there to set up a library of strategic compensation measures. So the intention here is you'll have a suite of pre-approved and approved by SNCBs, ENGOs, industry officials, kind of saying, yeah, these are going to work. Developer can pay into a centralized pot, which will be the Marine Recovery Fund, and then that money can be distributed to a series of measures that are already on that library and kind of really put the energy into where it's going to be most effective. Naturally, that's quite complex, so it has some teething problems, but the concept of that is really productive and really exciting. At the moment, there's only 3 things on that library, so we're working with how we can expand that, and I've jotted them down here of mean protected area, designation and extension, offshore artificial nesting structures, and predator reduction. So just for the time being, focusing on those seabird angles, offshore ANS, artificial nesting structures, they're really expensive and they're not necessarily the silver bullet. We hope that they can work, and there is evidence to suggest that birds do need artificial nesting in certain cases. But what we're finding, particularly in the UK, is that nest availability isn't the limiting factor. So we can build more nests, but it doesn't mean we'll get more birds. It might just mean that the same birds are moving around a little bit more. What they need is more food. So how can we target that? How can we think about that full life cycle approach? And then the predator reduction is generally considered quite a success story. The RSPB especially has done this multiple times kind of across the world on removing predators, particularly from islands. And when you do that, you release the pressure, seabirds tend to go up. It doesn't always work. Seabirds like to do their own thing. So how can we roll that out at a nationwide scale? How do we establish that at a much more national program of measures? And that's what we're trying to do through this work, and use that compensation to leverage the action. That's the kind of overall message, I think, from strategic compensation and from our experience here, is that government intervention is needed to recover seabirds, but it is under-resourced and underfunded to be able to deliver that. Many measures to recover seabirds are also out of the gift of developers. It's not their role to rectify the entire state of UK seabirds, but collectively combining those two, you can combine developer ambition, innovation, and the need to offset those impacts, alongside that government level of intervention and that ability to work at that national scale. That combined can really unlock an enormous kind of opportunity for seabird recovery, and that's where we're trying to get this to and push this, or where it's needed and in that area. So if we move on to the next slide, and this is kind of where I'll finish up today, is around what's missing from that process. So with strategic compensation, and you can see at the bottom here, we've got those various, the strategic compensation studies and the offshore wind evidence and change program. So we're starting to link some of these things together and work between ourselves and bringing in all sorts of people in that process, and to kind of basically expand that library. Where can we get the bang for our buck? We need to think bigger than that. So in the UK, all 4 countries have either developed or are developing seabird conservation strategies. So it's in England, this has been published. So that's what ESCART stands for. But it's essentially a list of measures that is needed to happen to kind of help seabirds. And that's not only the breeding sites, but it's their feeding areas, where they survive out at sea, and then kind of developing knowledge. So we're trying to use that as a framework for how we can put compensation to where it's needed. So a couple of those key areas are we're looking at a big, wide breeding colony package, to looking at multiple sites, multiple species across England. We're looking at bycatch mitigation trials, understanding what is needed to reduce bycatch at sea for particular species. And then we're also interested in, can that be used through compensation? And that's where kind of the Offshore Wind Industry Council are coming in to help us understand, is that possible to use that in the compensation context? And then we're testing some of that predator reduction in compensation. It's not been done on that sort of scale before as it has on the Isles of Scilly. So we're kind of working through that at the moment, of a large scale predator reduction, but through compensation at the moment. So it's difficult. A lot of those things there require changes. So the last point is around this habitat regulations, environmental compensation reform. So a lot of those changes above require non-like-for-like measures. They are impacting one species, and we're potentially talking about putting different species back. That's not currently how the HABS regs operate. And so there is an opportunity within that to kind of adjust that so we can have a better bang for our buck. So a consultation was launched this year that started to look at that, how we could allow that from happening. I think it's important to be open and honest here, and that we work really well and collectively, particularly with Kat and her team. But we do disagree on areas within this, because naturally we will do. But that's what we're working through, and that's why we're here, and that's why we have these conversations, to make sure that there are appropriate safeguards in place, and it allows us to build those developments as quickly as we can. So we're working through that, but it provides those opportunities to think broader and allow better things to happen at a much kind of larger scale. So I'll finish up with around, if we get the spatial planning bang on in the future, we can help unlock the leasing and reduce the dependency on those complicated and costly compensation. And if we embed ecologically effective strategic compensation now, we can really unlock the system as it stands at the moment and the current pipeline that we're dealing with. And that will enable this kind of truly nature positive expansion of offshore wind. And that's where we're trying to target at the moment. Those are our key areas. And Liv said it perfectly around, you know, how much we do up front now really drives what we can de-risk later on. And that's where I think we're all trying to head at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that wonderful message to end on. I think it's a good kickoff to our question round. I'd like to give both Kat and Olivia the chance maybe to respond to your presentation, and Olivia to respond also to Kat's. So maybe I throw the word first to Olivia to respond.
Yeah, thank you. I think they were very complementary in the way that what we're trying to do is articulate a challenge that we can't navigate alone. And I think that's the important part of this, is you won't get success with one lens, even if that was your aim. So if your only aim is to accelerate wind, it just won't happen without considering those other shared outcomes. And I think, as I heard, you know, more of the detail on, so what does the wind industry have to go through? Highly complex, long period of times, a lot of building of evidence to get through the development life cycle to a place where we're operating. And then we have to think about end of life. And I have been looking at the chat that's coming through on the side as well. And then at that same time, you know, the resilience of the marine environment is absolutely critical for any future development. So how do we change and shift where that risk and opportunity happens? And I think we're all saying, do things earlier, do them in a strategic way, and reduce not only the burden on the development community to think about this on a project by project level, but also gain the greater, more effective ecological gains by doing things in a strategic way as well. So from my perspective, it was really good to hear some of the detail and brought to life around both what is it that we're focusing on, those key areas that we need to think about, and really hearing that play through from Samuel in terms of, you know, what does it mean to have, you know, bird species as indicators on that overall ecological system, and what do we need to do to really make sure we're thinking about the ecological system as a whole.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Yeah, the interconnectedness between all of your presentations was very clear. You guys work very closely together, from what we could hear on many different projects and programs. I'd love to throw the word now to Kat to also respond to what Samuel presented.
Yeah, no, like Liv said, we all complement each other very well. And I would say there has been a huge amount of collaboration between all of the different organisations, and that it's hard work. It's taken a long time to be able to have quite robust conversations and build up that level of trust between the different organisations as well. Like Samuel said, there are areas where we do disagree, but we can do that in a very professional way, saying, right, okay, this is our red line, this is your red line. And I think we're at a stage where there are less surprises coming out of that and being able to work together on some of these solutions. I think we need to remember that climate change is the overarching issue that we're all trying to address here, and this is really where we've got a technology type that can move us away from fossil fuels, get us to a renewable based energy system. And I know all of my developers do their utmost to build these projects in the most sustainable way. There's been a lot of challenges, particularly in the compensation front over the last few years, and developers don't want to go down that route. They try absolutely everything they can to make sure that they avoid and mitigate their impacts as far as possible. But because we don't have, we do have a lot of evidence, but because there potentially is disagreement from different organisations on where that evidence level is, do we know what collision rates are happening with offshore wind? How can we build those into models? How can we build up that research around it as well? So there are still quite a few sticky issues around this. But I think my overarching reflection on all three of our presentations is we're at a point where we're like, okay, we've built out quite a lot of offshore wind. How can we do it better in the future? So all of these different mapping activities, all of this front loading will be very helpful for future projects. But right now we need to focus on these projects that need to be built to make sure that we can get ahead with moving to a renewable-based energy system in a sustainable way as well. So there's multiple different things that are trying to be addressed at the same time as well. So it is a complex picture in the UK at the moment, but I think we've got some really good best practice that can be used across Europe and globally as well. I think the final thing I'll say is a lot of our developers have projects across the globe, so they're very familiar with how different regimes work, and they know they need to comply with the country that they're working in as well. So what we're trying to do is learn from other countries what's working well there, but we do know in the UK we are slightly ahead of the game with having that 25 years of offshore wind development as well. So how can we make the best use of that vast amount of information that we already have?
Thank you so much, Kat. And you really, I think, did a great overview in a nutshell why we selected the UK for this webinar and why we think our viewers and other Ocean members can learn from what the UK has been doing in the last 25 years. I would love to pass the word on now to my director, actually, Christina Simioli, who I see has written a message in the chat. I realize there's quite a lot of questions and we will try and get to all of them. I'd ask you also to keep your cameras on and I will call on you to ask your question directly to the speaker after I give Christina the floor.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thanks to all the speakers for the very interesting presentations and the very promising way of actually addressing offshore wind and biodiversity aspects in the UK, so that we're looking at UK as actually an example for others to follow, and therefore understanding the challenges is also very important. Now, my question is on adaptive management, and because this is very much what we recognize is that it is as essential, and your evidence-based program is going actually to inform then the adaptive management in order actually then to make the change that is needed based on the results that you get from the evidence. Now, though we understand that, I mean, because of permitting systems and procedures, but also because of business models, this might be very challenging. Therefore, I wonder how you think this can be addressed, what kind of governance this would require, because it's a very promising concept, but indeed we see that it's also very hard to implement, and we would like to hear your views on that. This is a bit for, I think, everyone from the current state perspective, of course, but also Kat and Samuel from the industry and NGO perspective. It would be very good to hear. Thanks a lot.
I'm very happy to come in first on this one.
Go for it, Kat. Thank you.
So adaptive management is, it can be a really useful tool to move forward where there's uncertainty around different impacts. So how can we still move forward, but making sure that we're monitoring exactly what's going on? We have really clear thresholds and triggers to make sure that if those are being approached, then action can be taken to rectify those things. And in the compensation space, this is quite a hot topic at the moment. So how do you monitor the effectiveness of compensation? Where should those thresholds be set? And what actions should be taken if, say, a measure isn't performing as expected, or if, you know, on the positive side, if it's performing way better than expected as well? So what actions can be taken there? In terms of certainty for industry, I think it's quite a helpful tool to move us forward. But like you say, it does create more uncertainty. I think there is an acceptance around that and how we can move forward at risk. But to make sure adaptive management works as it's supposed to, we need to be really clear on the questions that adaptive management is trying to answer and making sure it's very targeted around those sorts of things. So it's not a general research program. It's right, we have this specific issue. This is the monitoring program. These are the actions that are taken in that. The other point around adaptive management is it is hugely resource intensive, and there needs to be a really clear commitment from all of those different stakeholder organisations that they will engage with the adaptive management process if that is the decision that's taken. So this may involve, say, getting monitoring information and being able to make quick decisions around that to make sure that thresholds aren't reached as well. But the other point around adaptive management is around increasing that evidence base and trying to fill some of those knowledge gaps as well. So there are multiple elements around it. Again, we just need to be really targeted around when we're using adaptive management and also where it's not appropriate. So if actions can't be taken, then adaptive management isn't suitable in those circumstances as well. So it's definitely not a silver bullet for everything, but there's a lot of learning that can be done in that space.
Thanks so much, Kat. Olivia or Samuel, did you want to chime in and also add to that?
To be honest, no. And I'm just, because I'm conscious of time and how many questions
Yes.
we're getting in, and Kat answered that brilliantly, I think I would just end up repeating.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Olivia. And I hope they answered the question for you, Christina. We have two really wonderful questions about decommissioning, actually, that I think would be quite interesting as we didn't cover this topic so much in the presentation. The first question is from Maria Nilova. If she could turn her camera on and ask her question to the speaker, that would be great. And then I'll also ask Paul Kirk had another question on decommissioning. If both of you guys are available and ready to ask your question, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, of course. I think the question is mainly directed at Olivia, just regarding the kind of the Crown Estate working for, you know, the government targets for certain offshore wind capacity, but obviously the industry in the UK is getting, you know, quite old, as we were talking about, and the wind farms that have been built at the start of the offshore wind development are coming towards their end of life. So yeah, I think there is a danger of, obviously at some point, well, whether it's going to be 2030, 2035, of a number of wind farms going offline if there are no kind of provisions in place for any repowering or kind of extension of life. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've worked with DESNZ to sort of see how the situation might be addressed in the nearest future.
Yeah, thank you. Really helpful question. And actually, yes, and not just us, because I think it's critical that we understand the market's intentions as well. So there's a lot of collective work looking at that balance between decommissioning those that potentially might decommission or any opportunities for extension of life. And equally, you know, part of your question, as you added it to the chat as well, what that then means for offshore wind targets and then pipeline as well. So that's a critical bigger picture that's being looked at, and we know that there are a number of projects coming towards their end of life, but also, you know, end of permissions, if you see it that way too, the marine licensing and the requirements set out on them. But the locations are interesting and add to the complexity as well. So these are smaller projects, they're closer to shore, and we know, you know, in terms of development of technology and the efficiencies of technology, you're not going to chuck some whacking great turbines in the same locations that those smaller scale wind turbines closer to shore are. So there's a lot of the kind of technological as well as environmental impact considerations to be had when considering, you know, extension and end of life. And that is all being worked through. So I don't have any answers for you right now. I know definitely Kat and others will have opinions on, you know, from a market perspective, what's being invested and thought about at the moment. But definitely there's a recognition of, as we look at future demand and needs, we build in a level of crudely described as attrition risk. So what might come away, and therefore what might we need to do to ensure that there is a continued supply of new development, and that's reflected in how we seek to meet the targets going forward. So there's a balance between those real active conversations on practically what could extension of life look like, what does decommissioning look like as well, so even to the point of full removal, cut off, you know, all of those kind of guiding principles around where the liabilities sit after decommissioning. They are conversations with government and with market and with ourselves on what that then means for the seabed and what we might need to offer going forward. So yeah, they definitely need a kind of whole system approach to as we're taking that consideration forward.
Yeah, thank you. That's good to know.
Before I let Kat comment on decommissioning, I'd love if Paul Kirk could also ask his question, which I think is very relevant and directed a bit more about at Kat. Paul, if you're in the room, we'd love if you asked your question. And if not, I will read it out. So he mentions that Kat mentioned decommissioning phase and nature inclusive design. Are the speakers aware of current DESNZ guidance advocating for full removal of all infrastructure for the end of life, and how this may act as a barrier to further nature restoration through mechanisms such as nature inclusive design scour protection?
Yes, we are aware of it. I think it is an ongoing discussion at the moment around decommissioning and what is appropriate, because of different other policy drivers. Say under OSPAR, there is a driver to do full removal of any offshore infrastructure. There is a clear case for potential artificial reefs and build up of ecosystems around some of these structures as well. So I think it's much more of a legislative and policy changes that need to come into place to make sure that we're not removing really ecologically valuable habitats that are built up over the lifetime of these different projects as well. But it is very much up to government to make those changes to policy. Again, it is something that offshore wind developers think about right up at the front, is the decommissioning strategies. And we've had 1 or 2 test cases around decommissioning in the UK, but obviously each project is quite different locations, different ground conditions, all of those sorts of things. So it potentially could be quite a missed opportunity if the policy still continues to be full removal of infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much, Kat. I hope that answered your question, Paul. Now I think there's a question for Samuel from Jonathan Abbott at SSE Renewables. Jonathan, could you turn your camera on and ask the question, please? If Jonathan is not still in the room, then I'll read out the question.
No, I'm here. Sorry. Is the video on?
Yes, we can see you and hear you. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think it was just a question really around understanding the seabird populations, how they've changed over time, and what are the main drivers for those seabird changes. So I think it's often framed, and I think it's generally accepted as received wisdom that seabird populations are declining, but I'm not always sure that that's necessarily correct, particularly for the species that are mainly impacted by offshore wind. And so I think I'm just kind of teasing out in general, taking that general kind of framing that seabirds are in decline, and then applying that to the context of offshore wind.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It's a really important question and really good to clarify. So we've got 25 breeding seabird species in the UK. 23 of them are red or amber listed, so are declining. There's only 2 which are not declining. So in terms of species relevant to offshore wind and the impacts, we typically think about gannet, razorbill, guillemot, kittiwake, sandwich tern, lesser blackback gull. All of those are either red or amber listed, some declining more than others. Kittiwake is a particular example, which is why I like to talk about kittiwake so much. Is they're an obvious one, but they are heading towards extinction, we think, in the next kind of 30 to 40 years within the UK, so kind of localized extinction. So the risk is quite high with those, but you raise a really important point that the building of the wind farm isn't what has caused that decline. And Kat mentioned climate change is a really important driver of that. We've got unsustainable fishing practice, invasive non-native species. We've had bird flu in the last 5 years decimate populations. So those are the impacts. What we're concerned about, I suppose, is that if we're not careful, building large-scale infrastructure, big spinning metal fans in those really important areas, it adds to those issues. So unless we see pressure removal before we see pressure addition, we're at risk of kind of burying a lot of those species even further down. So that's just the risk within that. But generally speaking, your question on there's 13 species, so there's slight differences in how all these models are done and X, Y, and Z. But in terms of good environmental status, the UK is failing on seabirds, and it's one of the only indicators moving away from target. And of those 25, 23 are red or amber listed.
Just to clarify that, so the species you mentioned, so gannet, puffin, guillemot, are they achieving good environmental status, or are they?
No.
You sure?
Yeah, so under the UK Marine Strategy, the latest consultation, good environmental status is failing on seabirds.
I suppose those specific seabirds.
Yeah, they are. Puffin is red listed, gannet's amber listed.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. To not end the conversation, even though we're already a few minutes over time, directly on a specific type of bird, I would love to hear from all of our speakers one last time, and maybe a question from the audience can tie into that. If we look beyond the UK to the EU and your European neighbors, what do you think are the most valuable areas of cooperation, either in policy or how you guys are already involved that you would like to share on how lessons from the UK can be broader and shared across seas?
I can kick off briefly. I mean,
Perfect.
in
Thanks,
terms
Sam.
of I think the Ocean Coalition, and I've said this before, is a really powerful tool in that space. And I think we have had to seek out those relationships and build them up with individuals. Whereas I think what the Ocean Coalition allows is that space to share that kind of information collectively and brings them together to be able to have those conversations. So it kind of cuts out that step of, okay, over time building things up, what do they know, what do they not know? And I think that's been really, really valuable. And from ourselves, from the RSPB, where we work across the BirdLife Coalition as well with members that aren't also in that coalition, it's a really useful tool to kind of test those things and work across that partnership as a collective as well. So that's been hugely valuable for us. And I always love this lessons learned thing, because you have to actually learn the lesson once you've been taught it. So it's about how we teach across, but then how we adjust individually to kind of better that. So that's been really positive.
No, that's great to hear. Thank you, Samuel. Kat or Olivia, did you have anything else to add on this? I know, Olivia, the scope of the Crown Estate doesn't go as far, but
it doesn't. But actually, I was going to echo Sam's comments, because it's exactly this. As a newer friend to Ocean, that's exactly the point. Is there absolutely in policy terms, it's really helpful when we have these global or European-led drivers that seek alignment in a particular way. But the practicality of then how and the interactions across administrations and really those topic areas, the thematic things, that is where we start to drive solutions and answers. And that's exactly why, forums such as this and those conversations and being able to learn from each other really do then help investment, which ultimately is global. Investment in nature, investment in wind is global. So yeah, it really does help to be able to interact on that scale.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And Kat, I'd give you the last closing words. We're already a few minutes over time, and thank you to all of the viewers who've stayed a bit longer for this conversation.
It's quite a lot of pressure. But yeah, I think it's staying on top of everything that's going on. So the forums like OCEaN, like OEC, are really helpful to have that sharing of information. In particular, I think one area where we can work really well with the EU, particularly in the North Sea basin and maybe the Celtic Sea as well, is looking at that cumulative impacts assessments as well, and how we can make sure that we're building in the most sustainable way, but we're also getting an accurate idea on what the actual impacts are across offshore wind. And some of that will involve the need for government interactions as well. Industry, all of these different stakeholders can do all they can, but ultimately some of this is down to the decision making as well. So
yeah, that is very true. Thank you so much, Kat, and thank you to all of our speakers and our viewers today. I will be sharing emails of all of our speakers today, so unfortunately, if your question did not get to be answered, you can reach out to our speakers later. A recording will also be available, as well as all the PowerPoint